Are we on? We are on. Okay. All right. Hello and good afternoon to everyone joining this colloquium session. As regular participants or listeners of our colloquium would have noted by now, the image on your screen is not that of your usual moderator. I am Indrani Bhattacharjee. I teach philosophy of education and allied courses in the School of Education, Azim Premji University. And it is my pleasure to welcome on all our behalf our colloquium speaker this afternoon. Dr. Mrinal Kaul is joining us from the Manipal Center for Humanities, housed at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. Mrinal has studied with some of the best known Sanskrit philologists and experts on the philosophical explication of the theory and practice of Tantra, and has been working for long years to make sense of the thought of the medieval Kashmiri figure about whom he will speak to us today. Um, his students at Manipal are incredibly lucky to have someone as well versed in the subject as Dr. Kaul is, to serve up, if one may use that expression, Abhinavagupta's work on a platter, as it were. So through this session, we hope to have a share of that luck. Listeners who have questions may please type them out into the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen, and these will become visible to the speaker at the end of the talk when he's prepared to take questions. So the official title of today's talk, a very intriguing title as it happens, is There a Philosophy of Joyfulness? Abhinavagupta's reply. With that said, I'll turn things over to Mrinal.
Thank you, Indrani. Thank you very much. I must begin by, of course, thanking you for moderating my talk, sharing my talk, and also to Professor Chandan Gowda for inviting me to speak on this platform. I'm happy, I'm lucky, and it's rather for the first time I'm speaking on the platform of Azim Premji University, so all the more happy. So when Chandan asked me for the colloquium, I chose. I have been trying to work on Abhinavagupta for some years, and I've been trying to understand the many facets of his um, of his, let's say, personality, in the sense how he is as a philosopher, as a hermeneutician, as an aesthete, and so on and so forth. The list can go on. So I gave him a title: Is there a philosophy of joyfulness? What probably it would mean we'll explore together. And what possibly, if there is a reply of Abhinavagupta, what it could be. For those who are not familiar with Abhinavagupta, he's a 10th, 11th century philosopher, roughly late 10th, early 11th, from Kashmir, that time's Kashmir, understand. It's important to keep the pre-modern categories in mind when we are dealing with these pre-modern authors. So the intellectual landscape that he belongs to, or we need to be a little bit obviously also familiar with that literary, philosophical, intellectual landscape that he's a part of. So he is often said to belong to this tradition of what is labeled as Kashmir Shaivism. I mean, it's a misleading idiom as well, for many reasons. One can have another talk on that, for what reasons, and so on and so forth. But what possibly that means is a non-dual Shaivism of Kashmir, which came into being, historically speaking, in kind of 8th, 9th, roughly 9th century, with his masters, grandmasters, someone like Somananda, and then later Utpaladeva, who he elaborates by writing commentaries on their works. Like he's writing this colossal couple of commentaries on Ishvara Pratyabhijna Vimarshini, the stanzas of Lord And then he's writing this colossal another work, which is called Tantraloka, which is basically, he would say, a ritual text, a ritual manual. He calls it a paddhati, which is what I kind of focus on mostly for my research. And these questions come up, say, for instance, when he says that it's a paddhati, it's a ritual manual, but there are many parts. It's a huge text, but there are many parts of the text which are highly philosophical. I mean, 250 or 300 years later, there's an author, Jayaratha, and he's writing commentary on Tantraloka, a very wonderful commentary, a long, wonderful commentary, intellectually very stimulating. So that helps us to understand many things. He's using Abhinavagupta's other works, for instance, to interpret him. He's also writing commentaries on aesthetic works, the Kavya Shastra works. Couple of them we have very prominently always being invoked. One is the Abhinava Bharati, the big, again, colossal commentary on Natya Shastra of Bharata. And then you have the Lochana, the eye, on the Dhvanya Loka of Anandavardhana. Well, obviously, this is also a question that, one should ask, and why is he choosing to write commentaries on these texts and why not others, and so on and so forth. I mean, one can have discussions about these ideas and stuff. So I'll come to the title, but I just wanted to give a brief overview of the author for the people who may not know him. But what I think I have been mostly interested in is Abhinavagupta as a hermeneutician. Now, what do I mean by that is that I see him not being satisfied for anything, whatever he's interpreting. I see him not being satisfied with one interpretation alone. He loves interpreting in different stratas. He loves creating layers. He loves creating this mapping. And this mapping is across many, so to say, disciplines, what we may call in the modern sense of the word. So you can say, I'm loosely using this kind of map. He's dealing with all epistemological discourse in his Pratyabhijna, the philosophy of recognition works. Tantraloka is a manual of ritual, but yes, you can say it's deeply metaphysical as well. You have, on the other side, you have, as I said, the aesthetic works, rasa works and natya works, and so on and so forth. And many other stratas are coming into being when he is trying to interpret ideas across the board. His main philosophical position, I would say, is abundantly unclear and not clear enough. The non-duality position, which is very distinct as far as the history of non-dualism itself is concerned in South Asian discourse, philosophical discourse, which is in many senses very, very distinct from what Shankara is doing, for instance, in the 8th, 9th century before him, or the Buddhist Vijnanavadins, Buddhist idealists are doing again before him. It may not be said that it's very different from what perhaps 5th, 6th century linguist, monistic linguist Bhartrahari is doing, because he's highly influenced by the linguistic monism of Bhartrahari. So how I define so his philosophical position, this non-dual position, is consciousness alone. That is to say that everything is of the nature of consciousness. Obviously, it's not that that easy to understand, probably, as it is for me to just say that or make that one statement. But one has to keep this in mind, that this consciousness alone idea is very distinct idea from the Buddhist idealist philosophers' possession consciousness alone. For them, if I may put it in just simple words as a background, for them, there is agency, but there is no agent. And there is where the main quarrel of Abhinavagupta philosophically speaking, main quarrel would be that, you cannot have agency without the agent, and subjectivity without the subject, and so on and so forth. So all these stratas, in some sense, they work together. And it becomes very difficult, I think, that to connect them together. So when I say connoisseur, do I mean the knowing subject in epistemological sense? Do I mean a metaphysical self? Do I mean the self of who? And so on and so forth. Or for instance, this idea of self, who is this self? And how does the idea of self work in these all different stratas at the same time? That needs a lot of mapping. However, for today's talk, I have just obviously chosen a very, very brief idea just to sort of experiment with things in a sense. So I'm going to read some parts. I'll also try to at the same time explain few things where I think that there is explanation needed. And later, I believe also that in a Q&A session, I can maybe open up or explain a little more where things are not clear. I have tried to avoid all technicalities, whether of philological nature or probably of any esoteric or deeply philosophical nature. I've tried to avoid all of them. I've tried to keep it simple, but I don't know how would it read. And so I'll go ahead and we can probably have a discussion later. One more point which is important to keep in mind is that whenever I say Abhinavagupta, it's very difficult, as some of you may already know or understand. It's very difficult in the Indian philosophical discourse, South Asian philosophical discourse, to create this distinction between the let's say school or the tradition and the individual philosopher. Which is very important to keep in mind, because whenever I'm saying Abhinavagupta, I partly also mean his whole tradition. Even though at the same time one has to be aware that he can be seen as a very distinct philosopher from who he is interpreting, for instance, like Utpaladeva at times, and so on and so forth. So one has to keep that side is also in mind. It's a general problem in I guess in philosophical discourse to which one should be really sensitive. I mean, philosophers like Dayakrishnan have talked enough about it. We haven't done justice to individual philosophers at times because we've just seen them as a part of the tradition only, and sometimes vice versa, which creates problems. So one has to be sensitive to that idea. So in this case, for instance, I've taken lots of examples from Tantra Loka, which, as I said, is a kind of ritual text. But however, at the same time, the question comes, is it the ritual text alone? Can it not be said that it's a text on aesthetics or epistemology, for that matter, and so on and so forth? So those questions will come. I think I'll just go ahead. Abhinavagupta's tantric system holds quite a unique position within the classical South Asian philosophical discourse, wherein a predominant essential presupposition is not conceived as suffering, dukkha, but an idea of everlasting bliss or joy. Now, I'm also translating many words from Sanskrit, so so when I say bliss or joy, I mean ananda, basically. And it's important to keep again in mind. Sorry, I'm also using this interpretative mode because I think it's really important. I just don't want to read the paper and and go ahead. But I'm sure all of you who are listening all of you are familiar with this word Anand, and every basis you come across this one word Anand, and so on and so forth. But how deeply philosophical in many senses has it been interpreted only by Abhinavagupta, and I'm not talking about others, for instance. That's something like very important again to keep in mind. In fact, even what is often understood as suffering, as Abhinavagupta would say, is a kind of intense form of bliss or joy or delight that one needs to cultivate a taste for. This phenomenon that a certain taste reflects under the tasting agent. Now, tasting agent, I mean the one who is tasting, who is the agent, who is the subject, who is experiencing the experience of taste, of anything for that matter, is the experience of joyfulness. There is no distinction created between the transcendental and empirical states of joy. in his non-dual Shaiva aesthetic universe, that is to say, Abhinavagupta's non-dual Shaiva aesthetic universe. This is the substratum where sacrality and profanity are melded together to let their total manifestation take place. If the ideas like total and manifestation are not clear, I think I'll gradually try to unpack them. What do I really mean by these words? The substratum of this experience is the knowing and experiencing subject alone. By knowing, obviously, you understand epistemology, and experiencing, you understand phenomenology. And I have written here not in the same sense as that of the Buddhist idealist, as I just spoke some time back. As one would expect, a number of potential philosophical problems of cognition, perception, imagination, error, and consciousness are involved in here. And their mapping needs further profound probing. However, I am gradually becoming convinced that the larger project of Abhinavagupta was an aesthetic project, wherein his critical epistemology had an underlying mission of achieving an aesthetic goal. This is abundantly clear from the works he composed, either prescribing tantric rituals or discussing epistemology with the Buddhists. Navajivan Rastogi and Raffaele Torella also claim that the whole purpose of the ritual prescription in a work like the Tantra Loka is to let all aesthetic emotions, rasas, manifest. Mason and Patwardhan have also referred to this affinity between tantric ritual practices and aesthetic performances, particularly in case of Abhinavagupta, who they call a tantric rasika. This should compel us to explore the hermeneutic affinity between the tantric ritual and aesthetic emotions or aesthetic performances. Let me begin by reflecting upon the title of the lecture. I hope I'm not late in doing that. By ness, in the word joyfulness, I mean the essential property of being, i.e., what it essentially is. And thus, it signifies the ontology of the experience of joy. The joy or bliss or delight are the words I have chosen to translate ananda, for instance. And the word full or filled with, that actually signifies overflowing with, is translating purna. So in other words, that joyfulness is a translation, roughly a translation for purna ananda ta or tva, which is this possessive suffix. In other words, we are referring to exploring the ontology of the experience of overflowing joy. But what is this overflowing joy? Or a sense of jubilation, or a deep experience of celebration? Let us look carefully into questions we may ask and look for the answers in Abhinavagupta. Let's try to understand his replies if he had any. So the rest focuses kind of on that, but I begin with questions. Abhinavagupta problematizes and thus theorizes the concept of ritual or of festivity or celebration, what he calls the parva vidin. His creative reuse involves philosophical rationalization of early scriptural sources, wherein is also involved this corollary of mapping cognitive act with a ritual act with an aesthetic act, i.e., does aesthetic relishing mean self-reflecting or self-recognizing, according to Abhinavagupta? Is he appropriating the concept of aesthetic relish, rasa, to fit within his non-dual Shaiva soteriology? But did Abhinavagupta understand all acts of ritual to be simultaneously as aesthetic performances as well? Or are all aesthetic performances tantric ritual for him? Is the concept of celebrating or festivity and rituals involved in there a completely subjective phenomenological process for him? Is that the reason why he emphasizes the process of mentation or knowledge more than the physical performance of ritual, for instance, or action? Is the radical idealist in him also starkly influencing the ritualist and aesthetician in him? In that case, in accordance with the non-dual Shaiva metaphysics, then the outermost physical aesthetic performance or ritual act is nothing but only the external manifestation of the internal contemplation of the subject that is governed by the absolute will. Absolute will here I'm translating as Ichha Shakti. I can explain later what that would mean in which context and so on and so forth. And absolute will of the totally autonomous agent. But is this supreme bliss both intrinsic and extrinsic to the self at the same time? Who is the agent of this joyous act called festivity or experiencing jubilation? And why does performance of this festivity become only evident in the act of willingness of the supreme agent? In other words, what it means, if I'm not clear enough, is that this idea of will, the with capital W, and we are not talking of desire here. To will is the agency of the agent, and that's how things become things come into action. It's only if a potential agent wills to do something and he or she is able to act. I mean, looking from kind of the philosophy of language point of view, which again he discusses in the same context in many other texts, for instance. Is Abhinavagupta appropriating the idea of rasa to fit within his Shaiva soteriological model? How closely is the aesthetic world of Abhinavagupta appropriated by him in relation to his rationalistic theistic world? Does aesthetic relishing mean self-reflecting or self-recognizing, which I have already kind of referred to? What is the ontology of the aesthetic experience for him, which is kind of the main theme of this whole paper that I'm trying to present in front of you? Can aesthetic experience be the experiencing of selfhood? So these are all the kind of questions which one should probably ask to problematize the idea, or just to try to understand what is he trying to do, or what is he trying to achieve by what he's discussing in his works, which becomes a really important thing, because we might just read him, understand him, and so on and so forth, but if we do not know what to do with him, what to do with his ideas, and so on and so forth, then it becomes, in a sense, kind of partially a futile exercise. Now I'm trying to go to the answer in his trying to understand few parts of his works where this idea of jubilation or joyfulness comes in. Abhinavagupta is suggesting that since the Shaiva idea of celebration is purely a subjective phenomenon, whether obligatory or occasional, no ritual celebration can be performed just because it is prescribed. Now, just a couple of things. The subjective phenomenon for him, when I use that term, for him does not mean that it is bereft of the objectivity. When he uses the subjective phenomenon idea, it is understood that the objectivity or the objective manifestation has no existence other than the locus, which is the subjective phenomenon. And this idea of prescribed ritual versus, for instance, the ritual prescribed festivity, prescribed ritual, and the idea somewhere I can sort of try to explain a little bit. Say, for instance, there are calendar festivals which, say, one Eid, Diwali, whatever festival, Christmas may come, and they come in a certain time. It cannot be, you cannot have Christmas today, you cannot have Diwali today or Eid today. It has a set calendar. Now that is what he wants to break that idea. When I say that he wants to break that idea, what I mean to say is that he's not denying that completely, but he's also saying at the same time, but yes, they are set things. Say on a day of festivity, you are gloomy inside your mind. So what happens to that idea of jubilation? What happens to that idea of celebration? You have to forcefully celebrate because just it's the day in the calendar. So he wants to say that there cannot be anything, any festival cannot be eternal festival in terms of like it cannot be coming on the certain date, certain so and so. But on the other hand, whenever the celebrating subject or the celebrating agent is overflowing with joy, or with the sense of this ananda, with the sense of this bliss, or whatever, basically this kind of celebration. It could be anything for that matter, and that's also what I'm going to discuss. And that's the moment. Then you have that celebration. So you're not supposed to. It could be any day, any year, any time, so on and so forth. That shouldn't matter. That's eventually where he is wanting to go, and he's arguing for that philosophically, which I haven't brought enough philosophical argument here, but that we can also discuss about. In other words, a celebration or a joyful experience is not what is merely prescribed, but it is a moment or an occasion that demands to be celebrated only if one is overflowing with joy. In that case, any moment is a moment of joy if the agent of the experience of jubilation is experiencing it. In that sense, since all rituals are to be celebrated according to the absolute free will of the autonomous subject, the one who celebrates it, it is not possible that any ritual could be either mandatory or obligatory or eternal. Thus, Abhinava begins to explain what a celebration means. He says, and this is his definition, the moment of attainment of totality or complete unity with one's own consciousness is called parvan, the word he uses for the celebration. Abhinava is purposely defining parvan, invoking the idea of completeness or totality. The moment of totality or completeness, purnata, is a moment of jubilation or celebration, just like the moment when one recognizes one's true self. Now, what I've tried to do is that, because in joyfulness, I'm trying to come to these ideas of, obviously, ness idea somewhere is to establish the ontology. But this full idea is very important. I mean, apart from the ness idea, the joy, which is ananda, and the fullness of it. So I want to kind of define those in detail, those two words. The concept of completeness or totality is quite fundamental in the non-dual philosophy that is represented by the idea of total resting or reposing in oneself, or being completely one with oneself. Probably a point about the affinity between the tantric ritual practice and aesthetic performances reiterated by Mason and Patwardhan should be kept in mind here. They say, and I'm quoting them, what is of interest to us is the similarity this process bears to a dramatic performance and the influence that this must have exercised on Abhinavagupta's incipient theory of aesthetics. The ritual is in fact an elaborate play that takes the greater part of the day. The goal is the same as the goal in any ordinary drama, to reach a state of perfect equanimity, blissful repose, where the Duti identifies herself with Shakti and the male identifies himself with Shiva. In this state of perfect, now unquote, and I read my own text, in this state of perfect equanimity, that is also called perfect I-hood, that leads one towards emancipation, which is nothing but the state of equanimity with absolute, where eventually an aspirant sees the ultimate reality, enveloping all the ontological realities in totality. Now, I don't know if this is sounding a little bit, for those who may not be very familiar with the terminology, or for instance with translations or his works and so on and so forth. I think I've tried to unpack it further, but if it is not completely comprehensible, I apologize for that, but I've tried to open it up. And this only happens when he or she is in complete identification with his or her own real nature, and there is no physical ritual involved at all. And it is, in fact, the same idea that also resonates with Abhinavagupta's philosophy of aesthetics. Like Navajivan Rastogi mentions, and I quote him, what the tradition calls bliss, ananda, is the astonishing experience of self-satisfaction that comes into being or is born out of the internal relish of the completeness, unquote. Rastogi maintains that the non-dual Shaivas of Kashmir took recourse to the concept of purnata, totality, as the central principle of their philosophy in order to prove the ontology of self. This ontology of self is embedded in the idea of the recognition of self as the absolute category. To further explain this, Abhinava himself offers a couple of illustrations. He says that, like for instance, if a number of spectators are enjoying a performance completely identifying with the characters those are being enacted, and suddenly a new person enters the auditorium. At that time, he or she does not enjoy the process of identification exactly the same way as other spectators do. The other spectators are already ahead at the level of enjoyment. But as soon as this new spectator enters the world of bliss of the other spectators who are enjoying it previously, the new spectator's consciousness becomes one with the consciousness of others. The only important thing is to be able to enter the consciousness. Otherwise, the process of identification does not take place. Paramahamsa Mishra has explained it with an eloquent expression. He says, Parvan is, in the auditorium of time, the play of the manifestation of the consciousness of the powers of yoginis that is gushing out and shines forth. Now, remember, I think later I'll say some point of time, this idea of enjoyment, unlike many other systems, for instance, the role of senses, because the role of senses is really fundamental in enjoying, for instance, whether that's physical enjoyment or not physical enjoyment. One can explain that, what that means. But these senses, what are called usually Karaneshwaris, are seen as or invoked as goddesses or deities, for instance. So here you have they are yoginis, So as soon as one enters the moment of time, there is where one gets the fruit of puja immediately. See, that's another important aspect to keep in mind, is that experiencing this enjoyment, worshipping your senses is to fulfill them, their I don't want to use the word needs, but fulfilling their function, for instance. Their function is to enjoy. So one enjoy in whatever sense. Different senses can enjoy differently, obviously. There also the idea of totality comes into being, because if you have totality experience of all these senses enjoying at the same time, it's a total experience. One of the reasons that's why should be kept in mind, that why is he that is to say, Abhinavagupta emphasizing more on the drama idea, where and not just simply a Shrauta poetry idea that you just listen or read or so and so forth, because all these Karaneshwaris, to say that all these senses are involved in say for instance drama, when we watch a performance. So it's like so understanding this idea, for instance, calling it puja. There is a long, I think this is a sort of paper in making, but I have had almost little longer paragraph there, or little few pages explaining, what does this puja mean, for instance, and that should take us to this pre-modern world, and make us understand, okay, how did they understand the idea of puja? Not only he, but all of these different prescriptive texts, for instance, and so on and so forth. At one place in the beginning of this stanzas of recognition in the commentary there, he would say that the idea of worship is simply, for instance, the subject objectifying and then returning back, for instance. So when you are prostrating in front of someone, for instance, or you are saluting someone, for instance, it's that you are seeing the object as you, and object is nothing but your own manifestation, your own manifested form, and you revere it, you worship it, and then you are the one who is basically the locus of that knowing, or locus of that experience, and so on and so forth. In other words, the object is nothing but the simple manifestation of the subject So as soon as one enters that moment of time, there is where one gets the fruit of puja immediately. Understand performance. Puja, performance is named as puja. Therefore, the bliss that one is able to experience because of the, I've used the word here, sarva tanmayi bhava. So sarva means all here, and tanmayi to be one with it. The bhava, the emotion of being one with all. Um, which is caused by a large group of people who are singing and dancing. That tanmayi bhava does not reside in each individual individually, but that resides in all of them together. The consciousness that is overflowing with bliss is able to experience total bliss when it achieves oneness in each one of these dancers, etc. In fact, observing grand celebration as a part of the process of worshipping a teacher or singing and dancing seem to have been prescribed frequently as a part of tantric rituals. According to Ranieri Nioli, this is what Abhinavagupta means to say when he reiterates. Now, this is a part of a translation of Tantra Loka I have borrowed from Nioli's translation, and I'm quoting him. The consciousness which consists of, it's a little bit archaic English, so I'll read it very slow. The consciousness which consists of and is animated by all things on account of the difference of bodies enters into a state of contraction. So consciousness has this, the contraction and expansion idea. But in public celebrations, it returns to a state of expansion, since all the components are reflected in each other. The radiance of one's own consciousness is ebullition, i.e., when it is tending to pour out of itself. And go back to the idea which I said, overflowing some time back. It is reflected in the consciousness of all the bystanders, as if in so many mirrors, and inflamed by these, it abandons without effort its state of individual contraction. For this very reason, in meetings of many people, at a performance of dancers, singers, etc., fullness of joy occurs when every bystander, not only one of them, is identified with the spectacle. The consciousness, which considered separately also is innately made up of beatitude, attains in these circumstances, during the execution of dancers, etc., a state of unity, and so enters into a state of beatitude which is full and perfect. In virtue of the absence of any cause for contraction, jealousy, envy, etc., the consciousness finds itself in these circumstances in a state of expansion, free of obstacles, and pervaded by beatitude. When, on the other hand, even one only of the bystanders does not concentrate on the spectacle he is looking at and does not share, therefore, the form of consciousness in which the other spectators are immersed, this consciousness is disturbed, as at the touch of an uneven surface. This is the reason why, during the celebration of the chakra, etc., it's a particular form of ritual, no individual must be allowed to enter who does not identify himself with the ceremonies, and thus does not share the state of consciousness of the celebrants. This would cause, in fact, a contraction of the consciousness. Unquote of the Noli's text. As far as the process of identification or absorption is concerned, Abhinavagupta is repeatedly mentioning that the highest form of worship, what he calls para puja, for instance, is the identification with the one who one bows at, i.e., the self. Worshipping is not a corporeal or a mundane act, it is a cognitive act. In fact, the idea of tanmayi bhavana, being one with the emotion of being one, is nothing but worshipping one's own self as absolute. And here, worshipping is nothing but the process of cognizing one's real self, i.e., identifying oneself with and as Shiva, the absolute self. Obviously, this terminology of the kind of theological terminology, if you want to call it, it's also very important to understand what role does it play and what does this mean when you use the terminology for subject and object like Shiva and Shakti. How, why? I have always believed, I think, is that, in South Asian philosophical context, there is metaphors have never been understood critically. The metaphor theory, for instance, philosophically speaking, and I think it's very important because we don't pay attention to these metaphors, whether they are theological, whether they're metaphysical, and so on and so forth. So sometimes we just simply, take them on their face value, or sometimes just deny the value they otherwise hold in the deep metaphysics a certain philosopher might have, and so on and so forth. But that's a sort of footnote. This is what Abhinava means when he says that identification with consciousness is the inherent nature of its own autonomy. Since the consciousness has absolute autonomy as its essence, and because of being of the nature of autonomy, it is also of the nature of intense bliss, the action or activity generated by that bestows delight in the heart, is for the sake of identification, i.e., with that consciousness. Celebration means relishing, or if put other way around, the experience of relishing is something that needs to be celebrated. And that is what should be considered the worshipping of self. The kind of delight or rasa that is bestowed by the group of entities bearing the identity with Shiva, the same rasa is offered in worship. Same rasa is offered for worshipping in the higher abode by the learned. It's a part of, here I'm trying to paraphrase. I think if it is reading a bit gibberish, it's a part of this I'm trying to translate here. It's also an important thing to keep in mind that, when I'm reading these texts and trying to kind of, write them in my own interpretation, it's very difficult to move away from the text and try to interpret them not in a different language that way, but to choose words so that it's not misinterpreted. Any idea should not be misunderstood by the listener, and so on and so forth. So sometimes things might be sounding gibberish, but I can take time to explain in Q&A if you want. Even this act of worshipping or celebration becomes worth venerating. So now here is a meta idea. So act of celebration is also venerated, for instance. So meta puja idea you have. Even this act of worshipping or celebration becomes worth venerating, as Abhinava would claim, attributing it to the venerable teacher Utpaladeva, saying, and it is his quotation, in the Pujana Stotra, my teacher has said, the relishing rasa of the celebration that constitutes of Shiva worship, where the tremor of all 36 ontic levels, ontic principles manifests fully. Self-cognition is Shiva worship, and that should be celebrated. Now, I was referring some time back to the idea of senses. I'll just quickly come back to that, and I just should be able to finish in some time. What is the role played by senses in an act of enjoyment? Senses are defined by Abhinava as deities or goddesses, and their only worship is to make them happy, i.e., to satisfy them. One may experience this satisfaction in having an ice cream or making love, for instance. For Abhinavagupta, a pleasant contact is reflected in the blissful abode of touch. It is indeed due to the pureness of contact that, when reflected, touch becomes fit for the enjoyment of making love, for instance. For the same reasons, explains his commentator Jayaratha, the pleasure of seminal emission of semen depends on sensitive or pure touch. A touch could be both pleasant or unpleasant. There is also the reflection of touch in a violent blow of a trident on our skin, because of which we feel agitation in our body. What he means to say here is that, see, the idea of touch, which he explains in case of all other all five senses, this idea that only pleasurable, what we call pleasurable touch, for instance, is not what I mean by that sensation of touch. I'm meaning something, the totality of it, which is to say that, say, for instance, if you get if you get a deep blow by an arrow, as he's saying here, um, there also you have that intensity, which is painful, but he wants to rise beyond that idea of pain and not pain. That pleasurable, what we call pleasurable experience and painful experience. He wants to rise beyond that idea and create a sort of abstract notion of both, and talk about it. Which he would also do in case of, for instance, epistemologically speaking, in terms of knowledge and not knowledge. Knowledge and not knowledge in his substratum, in his system. The not knowledge idea is not the absence of the knowledge. It is just the incompleteness of the knowledge that error takes place. And all you need to do is that you need to complete that process of knowledge, so that the error idea is removed. For that matter, error is not a fiction. It's not an illusion. It's an error as reality that is being referred to here. Jayaratha says, commenting on this line, blissful is a specific substratum of the yogic body, such as the bulb, heart, or base of palatal, which are loci of bliss. There, indeed, due to the pureness of contact, the touch that is fit for the enjoyment of making love is reflected. By means of this touch, there could be also the pleasure of the emission of semen and so on. For this reason, since it produces abundance of bliss, it has been defined as pleasant, sundara. Now, I have a small towards the conclusion, I have a small paragraph which is trying to give a sort of little background of these early Shaiva non-dualists, who usually Abhinavagupta is talking to, apart from Buddhists, or taking their categories to build them up his own philosophical system. They are inherently dualists, and his system, in opposition to theirs, is a monist, is a non-dual system. Now, as I said, see, for them, what they adhere to is this idea that impurity is the cause of transmigratory existence. Now, by impurity, what is referred to metaphorically is error, ajnana, for instance, not knowledge, or incomplete knowledge in that sense. Not knowledge, I'm using ajnana in the sense of incomplete knowledge. What is important, the only point which is important for them, ritual means a physical ritual. Because for them, the idea of knowledge is also something which is not mind idea, not mental idea. So, for instance, if they give an example very often, is that if you have, for instance, a copper vessel, on the copper vessel, because of corrosion, you have this a black layer getting on top of it. Now, that they call technically dravya. So if you have that physical, material, tangible layer on top of something, that can only be removed by a tangible act, like a physical ritual. What Abhinavagupta argues is that, no, wait, ajnana is a noetic entity which needs to be removed only by a noetic process, a noetic idea. So if you have some material substance in front of you, say for instance dust on a mirror, you have to remove the dust as a physical entity. You have to remove it. But in case of a mental process where, for instance, there is a mental veil, that veil for removing also needs a mental act. You don't need a physical ritual act for that. So he's arguing for a ritual which is a mental ritual, which is a visualized ritual. And that's why this marriage of jnana and kriya, this marriage of moksha and bhoga, for instance, is very important in his system. I'll just skip that small paragraph. I hope I have a little bit more time just to continue reading just this couple of paragraphs. In the aesthetic realm, one can understand the same idea of incompleteness of knowledge represented by the non-immaculate entity called obscurity that may not allow the rasa experience to take place in the heart of the connoisseur or the spectator. The complete manifestation of the rasa takes place in a spectator when he or she is overflowing with the experience of joy. And this can only happen in a connoisseur who is absolutely sensitive with respect to a certain emotion, or is in possession of a sensitive or an immaculate heart. A number of spectators watching a certain performance will have the same number of experiences. In other words, each spectator's experience will be different, even if all of them are watching the same performance. Here, the hierarchy of obscurities is in play. To have the total rasa experience, one's heart needs to be completely immaculate, like a spotless shining mirror, in which the total image of the performance would be reflected. In other words, the only way one can have a spotless heart is to remove impurities or obscurities out of it. And the only way to remove impurities or obscurities out of it is to get the heart back to its natural state, i.e., full of purity, which is what Abhinavagupta calls the state of being pure. The idea of nirmalata or nirmalya is completely synonymous here with the concept of prakasha or the light in his system, as also it is an alternate for sahridaya, that is to say, the dialogue between two hearts in his aesthetic world. This is important for us to keep in mind when we are evaluating the subjective and objective experiences of a spectator and spectator respectively. In Abhinava's aesthetic realm, it is the subject or the spectator who is of prime importance, because the real experience is the experience of the one who is experiencing it, i.e., the subject, and not of the one who is being experienced object. Even though at the same time here, one must keep this in mind, as I said some time back, this sentence can also mislead some people. That is not to say that the performance happening in front of you is not real. That is not what he is saying. He is almost saying something which is, if I may be allowed to say that, he's also almost saying something schizophrenic. That whatever is happening in front of you is purely the manifestation of your own mind. Otherwise, how is it possible that you are 10 of you, 100 of you in the same cinema hall, and all of you are watching the same performance completely differently? All of you, it is how you want to see that same performance. And you are giving life rather in your mind than on the stage to those characters. Now there are layers in there. There are basically actors who are enacting the characters and so on and so forth. There are many layers in there. In other words, the creative magical experience that is often described by the words like pratibha or chamatkriti or chamatkara is manifested inside the locus in which the subject or the spectator is residing. The object of experience might be fictitious or erroneous, but the experience arising out of it is real according to Abhinavagupta. For example, if we are watching a performance, an actor who can otherwise see or walk normally in his or her real life and who is acting a visually challenged or physically challenged character in front of us in a drama is manifested or projected as real to us. Here, from the mundane point of view, it is the spectator who is using his or her self-reflective awareness that is actually performing in front of him. That's what I meant when what I said some time back. However, from the supramundane point of view, the spectator is, he would say, the absolute subject himself or herself, who is watching the absolute play, the cosmic play, owing to his own inherent self-reflective creativity. This is the reason why the idea of reposing within one's own consciousness is emphasized by Abhinav. Reposing back to one's own self is nothing but getting back to one's own original state and being able to rest in oneself. In other words, moving from duality to non-duality, moving from thisness to I-ness. I think I will stop there. There are a couple of more points, but I'll stop there. I think I have exceeded my time. But I'm hoping that we can have some question answers. I can reflect on some ideas. Indrani, if you're there.
Yeah. Hi. While I guess Mrinal waits for questions from the audience, maybe I can ask you a clarificatory question to start off things. Yeah. So, sometimes emotions are the result of experiences that you didn't ask for, right? In situations, maybe I'm speaking crudely, correct me if I'm wrong, in situations where the Ichha Shakti is not involved. Let's say you experience some kind of violation of the self, or an insult, right? A person is bullied, other bad scenarios, gets raped or something like that. Now, those are experiences one did not ask for, and obviously those give rise to emotions of various kinds. Now, what occurs to consciousness in these situations? Because Abhinav is also giving a theory of emotions. Torella, for instance, talks about that, right?
Right.
Does consciousness then split at this point? To speak metaphorically, does it go from unity to disunity in some sense? Because the heart is definitely not nirmala at such times, and there is no scope of entering into an already existing expanded consciousness. You're not entering into a theater. So what is one to make of those events, let's say, which give rise to emotions?
Yeah, these are always, I'm afraid, very difficult questions. Why are they difficult? Because, see, there is the point where I was saying some time back. Um, it's very important for us, after trying to understand his ideas, to understand also what to do with them.
Yeah.
Okay, now I understand your theory of emotions, your theory of consciousness, and so on and so forth. Now, what do I do with that? I have enough of knowledge, so to say. I have enough of quantitative, what you have told me about, and so on and so forth. At one level, this, I get asked this question obviously very often. It's more an ethical question from one point of view. So what happens to consciousness? I think one student one day asked me, say, for instance, are you trying to say that, say, for instance, um, if somebody is humiliating someone on the roadside, a beggar, for instance, and are you supposed to enjoy that and not get there, or like that feeling that comes to you? What are you supposed to do? Or the example, for instance, I give sometimes, I can't remember Robert Browning's That Last Duchess or Portia's Lover, where you have this really bhibhats picture coming into, he portrays in front of you that he's strangulating the lady with her golden hair, and it's all blood, hair is in blood, and so on and so forth. And when you read that, you are enjoying, like, or you can take an example, for instance, the 70s or 80s movies, if somebody is interested in film studies, the idea of rape, as you said, how was it being portrayed? And everybody's watching cinema and like, oh, look at this, and enjoying that, for instance. Now, at one level, I think for him, he's very clear, and that clarity I have. No, I mean, this question is important from many points of view, and it's also important for me to understand like what to do with these ideas, that I always struggle with. But to begin with, it's very clear that this is an experience which is real as fiction. So, for instance, you go into the cinema theater, or you watch, for instance, you watch a fiction, any form of fiction, that for that time is real. Now, after some time, it may not be real at all for you. That's fine. And the reality, so he would philosophically try to come back to this again and again, saying that, for instance, you're very you get afraid very easily, by watching, say, horror movies. You watch a horror movie, you're afraid, but you enjoy it. Because next day you are like, oh wait, I want to go and watch that again. But you were afraid of that. Why is it that you want to go again there and watch it again, and then again maybe, and so on and so forth, right? And that is where sort of, his idea, he's very clear about it, that I'm talking about fiction as reality. And there is where I said in the beginning, this ontology, he wants to establish the ontology of something, this say imagination idea, for instance, if I may talk about imagination idea, which otherwise we very commonly would say, oh yes, it's error, it's imagination, it's fictitious. And that's exactly where he wants to come and bring in, no, wait, it is not fiction, it is as real as what you think otherwise reality is. And that is applicable. That's why there are many stratas, for instance, from where what I was saying, and what may be said in the realm of say the whole bhava idea, natya idea. There, his whole system is very technical. What is a response to what a certain bhava coming as a certain rasa, as a reaction, for instance, to certain bhava, and so on and so forth. How are they emerging? What goes wrong, for instance? Say, for instance, if I, as an actor, am wanting to invoke in my spectators, say, a certain emotion, and say I want to make them laugh, and certain spectator is crying. So is that what happens to that state then? I mean, it's a erroneous communication, or is it like, am I a failure? Is the spectator a failure? Is the connoisseur a failure, and so on and so forth? Um, so I don't know how exactly to answer that. Otherwise, what happens in his I guess one needs to really work on these ideas very carefully, rather. As Raghuram Raju says, that we need to really make these writers, or convert them, these writers, into authors, to be able to have this dialogue with them in a very space that we are a part of, and that's what becomes really very challenging from many points of view. Sorry if I just exceeded.
No, no,
Gone.
that's absolutely fine. There are questions coming in. Uh, yeah, it's a question from a student of ours.
So should I read and then comment?
Yeah, so he says, they say ignorance is bliss. How would Abhinavagupta respond to that? Can ignorance be seen as joyfulness, or would it be impurity?
Well, now ignorance. What I mean here is the lack of how do I put it? Because see, many of this terminology I'm translating from Sanskrit. So ignorance here is something which is the incompleteness of knowledge. It is not. I would say rather it's a technical term used in the system here. Impurity again is a term which I see whenever I say it, many people really misunderstand it. Impurity is simply an idea here used for something which is which is bereft of light, for instance, because you have the idea of light and darkness, and you can have darkness only if you do not have light. So impurity in that sense is meant to be here. That kind of a veil, if you have on, as I said, like on the top of a mirror, for instance, you remove it and you can see your face in the mirror. But if you have that veil or dust on the top of mirror, for instance, you are unable to see your face. So you have to raise to that level of totality where knowledge and not knowledge, in the sense of the incompleteness of knowledge. Because see, when you say, it's very simple. So say, for instance, Shankar also talks about it. When you say in darkness that, oh, I'm not able to see, that's not really the case, that you're not able to see. You are able to see the darkness, and thus you are saying that, no, I can't see, even though obviously you're saying a wrong thing. I mean, you see the darkness, you perceive the darkness, the perceptorial cognition, that process is taking place. But yes, it is not the perceptorial cognition taking place in the presence of light. So that's why you're not able to perceive the things around you, for instance. And that may be true about inference and verbal testimony and so on and so forth. I think I'm trying to read. So, can ignorance be seen as joyfulness? Well, yes and no. Um, how to answer that? uh, it depends on how one is understanding the idea of ignorance at the first place. If you mean to say, for instance, that can error give rise to, say, I can give you an example, which I didn't include in here. You know, what is the difference between me watching a real horse or a picture of a horse? Do I get more delighted by watching a real horse or a picture of a horse? Do I get more delighted, for instance, if you use an example, for instance, because this explains it probably better. Say you have a mirror and you see a naked person in a mirror, right? Now that is with the respect to the visuality that can give you pleasure, but with respect to the touch that cannot, because if you touch the image of a naked person in a mirror, you're touching mirror basically. You're not touching that person. You're not having that tactile perception of what you want to, so the mirror cannot give you the same pleasure if you want to touch somebody's body. But yes, it is sensitive with respect to eyes, with respect to the visual perception, for instance. So yeah, we can move on to another question, I guess.
Yeah. So there's a question from Chandan. It didn't fit into our question, the box. So I'll read it out to you. So he says that you noted that the ontological primacy that Abhinavagupta gives to Ananda denies to suffering an independent moral value and sees it instead as an experience that one has to cultivate taste for or take delight in. Have you reflected on this understanding of his?
Hmm. Ananda, I imagine he means Ananda Vardhana here. Abhinavagupta gives to Ananda, okay, denies to suffering an independent moral value. And see, I think, I don't know, this idea of, I get always confused because I don't think the from their point of view. Now again, from our point of view, we should be able to engage with these ideas. But as far as they are concerned, I don't think the morality plays any role for them there in what he's discussing. Now that doesn't mean necessarily that it shouldn't play a role for us, for instance. And I often say that, say for instance, mm, morality, the ideas of moral philosophy have been discussed in they have been in the pre-modern world a very hot topic of dharma shastric literature. And there are philosophical debates about that and so on and so forth, what ought to be done, what ought not to be done, and so on and so forth. But in his realm here, I mean, there is those moral questions do not arise for him, I'm saying. How do we make sense of them is altogether a different question. Um, and I'm trying to read the question again. Value or sees it instead of experiencing that one has to cultivate taste for it, take delight in it. Mm, not that I have a very good idea how to, how to engage with that. Do you have a question, Indrani, on that?
Goodness, no.
Since
Much.
your question was also resonating with that idea, and
No, of course, I would be thinking of Tagore and suffering and so on. And he's big on suffering. What kind of rasa is that, I wonder?
see, I think what we do very often is that there is a very important need, and this must be said, and that's why I'm taking a little bit time to say that. I think we have not read these authors very carefully. That now, when I make that statement, it could be a very big statement. in the sense that there are scholars who have done wonderful work and so on and so forth. But even if you look at Shankara, for instance, or Abhinavagupta and so on and so forth, we we don't we are not sensitive, first of all, to their ideas or to understand them at their own level. For instance, what does he really mean by what he's saying by using an idea of dukkha, for instance, and suffering and so on and so forth? Now, that suffering idea, as you know very well, say, for instance, for a Sankhyavadan, Sankhya system believer, suffering is all that there is. For instance, the whole Buddhist corpus, dukkham, sabbam, dukkham, you have the existence in pain and so on and so forth. Now, all systems are beginning, even developing whole epistemology with that idea. Oh, we have to know the pain, and we have to know the nature of pain, and that's how you have dharma people and all people coming into being. And we need to understand the nature of pain, and that's how we can get rid of it, and so on and so forth. Now, here, what what all he's doing is turning the tables upside down. He's saying that suffering, whatever you're calling suffering, is also something that we enjoy. It's something, and he's wanting to create this meta layer of, now when I say enjoyment, it is not bereft, that meta level of enjoyment is not bereft of suffering. You have this, and when I say meta, the meta layer doesn't mean that it is bereft of the physical or so on and so forth. It's that totality idea, the purnata idea becomes really important in his case, where and this consciousness idea becomes really important. Say, for instance, for Buddhists, it's very interesting and important at the same time to say that all these idealists, now I've recently tried to bring a paper where I'm arguing that let us not call him a radical idealist. Let's call him, taking the term also that Arindam Chakrabarti uses very often, is dynamic realism. He's not telling you that the reality is a fiction. No. But he's emphasizing of the dynamism of both the ideal and real at the same time. Now that's more important, And how does that work together? How does that function together? How do we know that? How do we understand that? And what does it mean there at that level? This idea of ananda, and he would, for instance, in the what I call usually the linguistic hermeneutics, for instance, if you see this purnata idea, he takes recourse, for instance, to Panini. He would take recourse to these grammarians, for instance, trying to seek validity from them partly, but also at the same time building his own system through them, trying to say that, okay, what does this purna means what? And he would get the two verbal roots from Panini and try to say parva means what, that totality means what, that total experience, and so on and so forth. The same way, if you look at the word ananda, for instance, it's that, the prefix, which is asamanta, which is completely, there is nothing left, which is nandati, in the sense jubilated. And if you take the example, for instance, of all of these idealists, as I was just saying, you have right from Bhartrahari down to, I don't know, Abhinava himself, you have Shankara and the mate of Vasubandhu and Dharmakirti school and so on and so forth. All are idealists, so to say, to use the term idealist. And all are talking about non-dual, all are talking about consciousness and so on and so forth. Yet, that non-duality, everybody is completely radically, talking about it differently. So if one is going to write the history of non-duality, this is how is Bhartrahari different from, for instance, Abhinava different from Shankara, different from Vasubandhu, different from Dharmakirti, and so on and so forth. And they are each other's, in a sense, philosophical enemies. Say Abhinava, he's building his whole idealism on the basis of the idealism of Dharmakirti, for instance. He's also talking about mind only, and he's also talking about mind only. Where is the distinction? Where is the consciousness only? Consciousness only. Where is the distinction? So here, just one subtle difference from some point of view. His definition of consciousness is different, and his definition of consciousness is different. The Buddhist is saying that there is anything which is outside the domain of consciousness can never be real. He's saying, wait, you already said that. So the fact that you said that is already the proof that it is the domain of consciousness. So there is nothing outside the domain of consciousness, for instance. So at that level, when we look at then what he's trying to do, establishing this whole metaphysics, epistemological ideas in this whole corpus, and how, say, ideas about this fullness, the joyfulness, and so on and so forth, how they are to be seen in the background of that. Um, yeah, I mean, sorry, I was just like saying
Yeah,
things.
that's fine. There was a question from one of our students, Chitra,
Sure.
um, along the same lines actually as the previous ones. Are you drawing a parallel? There you go. Are you drawing a parallel to indicate that what we experience as real may be fiction? A concept of the world being Maya.
Mm. Well, see, you can keep two things. It's rather an important question from many points of view. Mm, for Abhinavagupta, this parallel doesn't exist. As I said, everything is real for him. This parallel exists for instance, Shankara. You know, Shankara would talk about three layers of reality. It is not the case that Shankara is talking about world being Maya in the sense that okay, it is not. At the very empirical level, it is, and he's accepting that idea, like also Abhinava, so and so forth. But he would say that ultimately it is not, from ultimate point of view. And the larger problem with the Vedantic discourse is that they have never been in their history, rather. But I'm not very well versed with the later Vedantic discourse, but like Madhusudana Saraswati and others, and they have tried the five mittatva, for instance, the five error discussion is there. But if Shankara and larger discourse, this idea that world is a fiction and world is an illusion, and it needs to be, now what is more important, it needs to be um, um, dejected, it needs to be removed, you need to get rid of it. That nivritti idea, that say, I give example, for instance, very often jokingly, if Abhinavagupta would have written Yoga Sutra, the second sutra of the first chapter of the Yoga Sutra, defining yoga, is Yoga Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of the modifications of mind. I often say to kids jokingly that if Abhinavagupta would have written that, he would have said Yoga Vritti Sambhogaha. Now, Sambhoga meaning here that you should really know how, if you are a connoisseur, if you really know how to enjoy the modifications of mind, you will do that. You do not need to control the mind. You do not need to get rid of things. You need to indulge in things. That's the difference between Vedanta and Vedantic non-dualism and Advaita non-dualism. There is where the Maya, the illusion idea, for instance, for Vedantins becomes something which is to be, which one has to get rid of, or which is seen something like more, because they are like a sannyasi order, and they're like, okay, we have to get rid of the world. And you can see in the commentary of Upanishads, Shankara is very radical about that. No, we need to get rid of these worldly attachments and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the system here is talking to you and telling you that, wait, it is for you. Please go and enjoy. I mean, you can ask also the question that, okay, how are they different from Charvakas then in that sense, which can be another debate altogether. One can establish that. Um, but world, and this is what is very important, world, the empirical, whether transcendental, nothing is not real for him. It's all real. In the sense of, even, for instance, an error happening, if you take the very famous Vedantic example, you see silver in the seashell, for instance, but that seashell and silver, both are real. It may be real for the time being, as you say, something which is leading you to the seashell, and you like, okay, wait, there is silver there, and I can pick it up, make money, and so on and so forth. But for that time, it is real. That's why, for instance, when you go into the auditorium, you see the performance. For that time alone, it is real, but it is very much real. And it doesn't, by that virtue, it doesn't become fiction at all. And so, if everything is the domain of consciousness, you cannot say, like, for instance, a Vedantin will say, this is a Jada Padartha, this is an entity which is bereft of consciousness. A Vedantin will say that. Abhinava would say that how is it possible that when you are saying that it is a pen in front of you, you are not, I wouldn't use the superimposing, that would be Shankara, for instance, but the cognition of this pen is taking place within the domain of the awareness of the knowing subject. So pen cannot be an entity which is inert. In other words, if you go ahead and try to say that I am watching this pen, I am seeing this pen, he would say the pen is also watching you. For him, the pen is very much just looking at you, it's watching you. It's not possible that you are looking at pen and pen cannot see you. Pen is watching you, it's looking at you. It's a part of your very conscious nature, the awareness. One can debate about that. One can talk about that. How does he prove epistemologically that idea, whether through perception or whether through, these layers of syllogism and so on and so forth. That in the Pratyabhijna Shastra he does. I mean,
I'll read the next question. It's a two-parter from my, again, one of our students. I feel there's a difference between the manner in which joyfulness is arrived at in performing arts and in visual arts, because there are moments of shared consciousness between the artist and the audience in performing arts. How does the same translate to visual arts?
Not that I know enough about it. Again, I get asked these questions very often. Visuality. See, I think not that Abhinavagupta hasn't discussed about it in parts of Natya Shastra. He's talking about it, so one can partly go there and look for ideas what he's talking. But if one has to look at the idea of idea at a very abstract level, what he's talking about in terms of experience, for instance. Now, this is my understanding of Abhinava's whole system. And that's why I said some time back, the visual for him will give you only one-sided experience. Now, and that doesn't mean that, when you see a beautiful picture, for instance, you will not be, delighted by that picture. Absolutely, you do. But for him, it is not the total experience. And that's why this totality idea becomes really important. Music, for instance, again, is only sensitive to the idea of being able to listen, being able to hear, right? Visuality, listening, and so on and so forth. These are obviously aesthetic experiences or experiences of some kind of rasa, but scattered. Now he is after, and that's why the idea, for instance, if you carefully go back to what I was trying to read, this idea of group, this idea of totality, this idea of bringing in together. See that man when he's going inside the auditorium. That's one of the examples he gives in Tantra. He is about to begin. He's beginning to have that experience. He's not yet had the total experience, and once he gets into the whole group, and begins to be a part, after some time he becomes the total part of this group and starts almost, not exactly, almost forgetting himself and becomes a part of just the delight, pure delight, to use his terminology, right? So he would say rather that these are different, say, visual and what one can listen to and so on and so forth, but together they bring more delight, which he would refer to the total delight, right? That is not to say that he's ignoring, for instance, any terms, by any means, any individuality idea, and so on and so forth. I don't know if I have anything more to add to that.
We could go with the, yeah, this is another question from Chandan. So you said that Abhinavagupta is routinely classified as a Kashmiri Shaivite. Can you explain why one ought to be more careful in this regard?
Is routinely classified as a Kashmiri Shaivite. Can you explain? No, I think what I was trying to say is that that designation that is given very often to him being the exponent of Kashmiri Shaivism. I mean, obviously he's talking about Shaivism, and he's one of the champions of that non-dual system, non-dual Shaiva system. What we often forget is that he's not the only one. I see also these days, obviously, Abhinavagupta has become a fashion. As Professor Ashok Lujkar once would tell me, he said that there was a time in North America where in the morning Chomsky would sneeze, and by the afternoon the whole North American universities would talk about, oh, do you know, in the morning Chomsky sneezed today. It was a fashion. So today also it's like Abhinavagupta has become a fashion, with whatever that means. But what I'm trying to say is that was exactly why I was invoking Daya Krishna as well, because obviously he cannot be seen bereft of, say, his grandmaster, someone like Utpaladeva. Someone like before Utpaladeva, you have Somananda. And then the contribution that his student Kshemaraja made to non-dualism. So all of them have to be, one has to do justice with all of them. That's one. Second is that this non-dualistic Shaiva idea, it's not that time even in Kashmir. I mean, everywhere else, like you have Karnataka, there was Veera Shaiva here with Basavanna and others, revolutionary, another layer, you can say, altogether. And then you have the Thevaram in the Tamil, songs and so on and so forth. But at the same time, in Kashmir itself, the contemporaries of Abhinav himself, someone like, say, Bhatta Ramakantha, and before him Narayana Kantha, they were also philosophically rationalizing the dualist Shaivism, on which you have obviously the wonderful work of Alex Watson. Rather, the only work that has been done is by Alex Watson on the dualists. And they are no less champions, the dualists, philosophically speaking. Now, the problem with the designation, I have finished a paper, it's yet to publish, on this notion of Kashmir Shaivism, this term. It's basically a colonial construction, which comes from Jagadish Chandra Chatterjee. He was the first, that time by Maharaja brought in Kashmir in 1902, and he's asking him to establish the research department there, and he writes this first book in English of its kind, which is titled Kashmir Shaivism, and then it becomes an infectious term. Everybody using it, not understanding what does it really mean, and erroneously it always is referred to only non-dual Shaivism, as if there was no other Shaiva, stream. So I see as an injustice to the dualist Shaivism, for instance. Either the term should be used, for instance, the total corpus that was there even before the non-dualism came into picture, the whole dualistic tradition before an Agama tradition. So in that sense, rather a non-dualist philosopher term is more, it's not plausible in my case. I would never use the term Kashmir Shaivism. I think it's misleading in many senses.
Okay, we have time for one last question, I think. So this is, there we are, from Ashwati, another student of ours. Is it possible that we as Rasikas are by default or by design prone to experiencing, enjoying, and reacting to certain rasas more than others?
I would say, by default or by design, I would say both. But it depends on so many things. Say, I would give you examples. You are going to you're going to watch romantic movie in a theater along with your mother or your parents, for instance, how would that experience be as compared to if you're going with your brother and sister? That's one layer. Another example, how would your experience be watching the same movie along with your, say, partner, for instance? All these experiences are going to be different. What I mean to say is that um, depending on your own state of mind. For instance, I'm watching humor, a movie which is super humorous. But before I went into the cinema theater, I broke off with my girlfriend, for instance, right? So that humor is not going to do anything to me, for instance, unless I completely, I don't know, depending on my state of mind, completely choose to get away with that earlier experience and completely am absorbed into the what is being projected to me. That can also happen. Um, it's a process which varies. It varies every time differently, and that's why the idea that I think referring to earlier, this theory or idea of manifestation becomes very important. What he calls abhasa. It is all within you. All you can never say that you are bereft of any rasa in your either mind or body, whatever you want to say, or you can react to any rasa any point of time, whether in with any intensity or less intensity, and so on and so forth. It's just a manifestation of whether you want to say you reacting to a certain thing. So a certain emotion manifesting within you, and the reality of that is, according to him, the manifestation alone, nothing else. And that's why it's the whole rasa or something. This whole idea is just phenomenological, purely phenomenological idea. Joy, any experience of it, and so on and so forth. It's a matter of just letting it manifest, or it being manifest, provoked by something, and so on and so forth. And that's why the Abhasavada of, for instance, Abhasavada in the sense like the theory of Abhasa or theory of manifestation, and you would see that Vedantins also use that. In Vedantins' idea, it is complete fiction, say illusion. You are seeing the world appears to be, but it is not. As compared to that, world is a manifestation of the subjective awareness alone. That's what he would think for.
Right. I guess we are at the end of our time today. Thank you so very much for speaking to us. I'm sure it opened up actually a whole area of inquiry for our students in the audience. For me, your talk was exhilarating. What's the word? Ullasa generating. That's shall we say?
No, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you ever so much for it. And thanks also to the audience and to those members of the audience who asked questions. Thank you all for joining us and have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you.